Hello and welcome to this week's Compact Conversations. I'm Geoff Shullenberger and I'm joined today by Michael Cuenco, who is an associate editor at American Affairs, who has at this point contributed a good number of pieces to us at Compact. And his most recent is marking the 100th anniversary of the death of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. And I think, much of what we'll see around this anniversary will be kind of from commentators on the political left saying, Lenin is, still a lodestar, someone we should, turn to as a great revolutionary. Got the whole thing started, even if the Soviet Union didn't end up quite what we imagined. And then you'll have people on the right sort of saying, good riddance, and we need to continue to kind of exercise the malign influence of this kind of monstrous authoritarian ideologue. So, Michael, I think it's safe to say your take on this does not fit into either of those kind of standard, either kind of eulogy or demonization that we're likely to see. So, so it's quite a unique take. So, what inspired you to mark this anniversary? And how do you see Lenin as still someone we should be thinking about today?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is I've always sort of had a fascination with the Russian Revolution and the history of the Soviet Union. Since I was a child, I even tried to learn Russian at one point. Didn't get very far. I taught myself how to read the Cyrillic alphabet, but that's about it. Sometime around the decade of the 2010s, I noticed that other people in the discourse and among my peers started talking about, Lenin and the Soviet experience, not just from a historical interest point of view, but from an active sort of political point of view. And this coincided with things like, the financial crisis and sort of the socialist moment post-Occupy. Everybody started reading Jacobin and thinking about sort of what lessons that period of leftist history might impart for young aspiring revolutionaries today. But then something funny happened in around 2016 when you had both Trump and Bernie, and that is, of course, when Bernie Sanders sort of mounted his campaign for president. Of course, he wasn't going to talk about Lenin and modeled himself on that. He wanted to talk about sort of the good side, the good, positive examples of socialism, i.e., European-style social democracy. And he kept mentioning, we need to be more like Denmark and Scandinavia. The funny thing around 2016 is you started hearing more from the right, started hearing more references to Lenin and Leninism from the right wing rather than the left. Principally, this came from Steve Bannon, who was reported as being a Leninist of some kind because he, and I quote this in the piece, that he wanted to destroy the state, Lenin wanted to destroy the state, and Bannon wanted to do the same. And this became sort of like a motif among the new breed of new right. At the time, it was called alt-right. Now it's the new right, these new right sort of angry young conservative insurgents. They sort of took on Lenin and the Leninist approach to politics and made it their own. Of course, it's not a philosophical or ideological agreement with Lenin, but as I say in the piece, more of a Leninism of style and temperament. The appreciation for the revolutionary daring, at an aesthetic level, I think that's always sort of been there. But I think what the sort of elitist sort of aspect that became associated with him after he wrote What Is to Be Done, which is also precipitated the split within the Russian Social Democratic Party between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. I think that elitist aspect of building a core of highly organized professional revolutionaries, I think it's found actually a greater resonance on the right recently. And again, in the piece I mentioned Rufo, who explicitly used that term vanguard because he wanted to build up, highly politicized elite that was going to finish the work of his project of conservative counter-revolution. The left, as far as I'm able to tell, is, less explicit about that. I don't think they've adopted the language of a professional vanguard for themselves. So yeah, I think it's an interesting thing that at least that aspect of Leninism has been more present on the right wing.
So it might be worth pausing and giving a bit of background here, because it's somewhat interesting. So as I understand it, part of what distinguishes Lenin in his time, particularly kind of within the various factions of the left, were kind of jostling for influence and power in Europe, in the sort of communist movement. He was and is kind of known for advocating and having kind of pursued, a sort of vanguardist approach where, instead of building a kind of enormous mass movement of the working class, which, ostensibly in some Marxian accounts will kind of lead the revolution, he sort of had the idea that you could have a kind of highly disciplined party elite of intellectuals that would really kind of lead the way. This also ties to this question of, when is the time ripe for revolution? There's kind of this idea that, in Russia, you have to wait for it to develop a certain amount, for capitalist conditions to take hold enough that you can actually have a proletarian revolution, because you still in Russia only have largely have a peasantry and only have a proletariat in a handful of cities. And so there's kind of this question of like, do we have to wait, and should sort of Marxists essentially support bourgeois democratic liberals in order to create the conditions that will allow for the revolution to actually happen. And so Lenin's answer to kind of both of these standard more dominant ideas at the time, right? One, that you need an enormous broad-based workers movement, and two, that you need the conditions to be ripe kind of, in the manner that sort of, Marx diagnosed them in like 19th century England at the height of the Industrial Revolution. And so Lenin kind of rejected both of these ideas, right? And said, no, you can actually take the lead as a sort of highly disciplined party leadership cadre. You can also kind of, more opportunistically like find openings in history that will allow you to push progress forward at a more rapid pace, perhaps. So I think it's been a while since I've read about all these debates and so on, but I think I'm characterizing it mostly correctly. And, if you have any corrections, let me know. But I'm curious to know, your thoughts on like, if we want to be specific about what is Leninist, are these kind of the things that both figures on the right and the left are attuned to about him, or is it just a more general kind of appreciation of his revolutionary like daring and bravado?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is it's really interesting. There's this new generation of the right that wants not so much to distinguish itself from 20th century leftism, but to put distance between themselves and sort of the previous generation of well-behaved National Review, Reagan-Buckley type of conservatives. One of the ways that they do that is that they adopt these radical tropes and aesthetics, sort of wear that proudly as a badge of honor. We're the revolutionaries now. Like that seems to be a big thing with a lot of young conservatives these days. Lenin is a pretty easy way to communicate that.
On the left, like the idea of there being a sort of mass workers movement aligned with the left is quite absurd today, right? Clearly doesn't exist. And I think most of the left is pretty, begrudgingly or not reconciled to that reality. So in a way, this whole question of like, do we need to build a mass workers movement, or do we need to rely on a mass workers movement and kind of let them take the lead or not, is in a way kind of moot. Whereas ironically, you might say on the right, there's kind of more of a greater sense of like a mass politics that can kind of mobilize people who aren't, sort of part of the educated class. And that, of course, for the left and for liberals kind of raises the specter of fascism as a kind of mass politics. So, part of me wonders is, okay, I mean, maybe in part they talk about Lenin because it's at least a way of kind of not, it's a way of not associating themselves with the things that liberals always associate them with, i.e. fascism, ironically enough, that they're sort of saying we're at least strategically following the model of Lenin here, in part because it's kind of a useful way of like not feeding into that liberal narrative, even though it does at the same time mean that they're kind of, violating long-term, what might have been taboos on the right against kind of saying anything positive about any figures associated with communism. And this is something you've written about elsewhere in a long piece called After Populism is at this point almost
around a year ago,
which I think has been borne out in all sorts of ways. So I encourage readers to go back to it. You talk quite a bit about the kind of radical self-styling of the right, and so how kind of attaching itself to Lenin's aesthetic and image is attractive in light of that, especially because it would be kind of too politically awkward to like directly do that with, say, Mussolini, right?
Yeah, and some of them do that anyway, right? I mean, some of the online people do that a lot.
Whatever we think of Lenin's sort of projects, he was capable of actually developing and implementing a project that would profoundly transform the kind of material world of the society he took control of. And, part of what you argue in the piece is that this is in a way something that's quite hard to imagine now for either left or right. Regardless of how much they might, attempt to style themselves after someone like Lenin.
The big point of contention among the revolutionary generation in the Soviet Union was, what to do now that they've taken power. Do they make a leap, a straightforward sort of jump into socialist development, or do they sort of pragmatically retain elements of the capitalist economy? The result of that was the new economic policy, which was this kind of strategic retreat from the orthodox socialist position, which allowed the persistence or the preservation of elements of a capitalist economy and a market economy, while the state retained control of strategic sectors. They'd allow, small businesses and peasant proprietorship. And that was sort of the pragmatic thing to do. And that was sort of the divide between the left and the right sides of the Bolshevik Communist Party. This was a question that really preoccupied the revolutionaries. As I mentioned in the piece, eventually Stalin wins the power struggle, decides to chuck the new economic policy and go for collectivization. And he establishes that as sort of the orthodox line interpretation of Marxism-Leninism in the Soviet Union. Strangely enough, the new economic policy blueprint finds its way to a young student revolutionary whose name is Deng Xiaoping, who's studying in Moscow in the 1920s. And fast forward a couple decades later, when he takes power in the late 70s, he implements a program which retains Communist Party political control, but allows for economic liberalization, which is basically a version of the new economic policy writ large. So, these were the kinds of questions that those revolutionaries struggled with. And when I'm looking at these, so-called Leninists that we have today, I'm not seeing any thought put into structural questions like this. I'm not seeing any thought put into questions of capital or labor or industry or anything like that. Instead, it's about DEI or what's being taught at the English department at, Yale or Middlebury College and stuff like that. So, there's just this interesting kind of, as I said earlier, Leninism of the Leninism of style and temperament is not the same as the Leninism of actual, material transformation and old fashioned kind of revolutionary politics. So that's an interesting kind of thing to consider. Is there any way these people that we have now, these Leninists today, is there any way they can reapproximate that? Or are they just stuck squabbling over kind of different forms of cultural recognition and personal expression?
The new Argentine president, Javier Milei, spoke in Davos 2 days ago. And, a few things struck me about it. One is kind of this weird way that you have figures on the right, in his case, the kind of, in a way, sort of very, extremely conventional libertarian right, positioning themselves as sort of this sort of insurgents and radicals of the day. And, in his portrayal, we are sort of living in this world that, he basically he gave this list of all these things from Keynesianism to Christian democracy to God knows what else, and said, well, they're all basically the same thing and they're all just communism, right? And so, and his account is actually that, really any state it really is just the most dogmatic, simplified libertarianism I've seen for a while. It's like, any state intervention is already communism. So in his account, we are living in this kind of de facto communist world. And, it's just this kind of, tiny, cohort of insurgents like him who are fighting against it and speaking truth to power, right? Which is an extremely strange spectacle at Davos, right? Which is whatever everybody thinks about the, Great Reset and things like that, and policies that it's promoted, or memes and phrases that it's promoted in recent years. It is really a world center of pro-market neoliberalism, and has always been that. So it's very weird to see, that some of these people on the right, really conceive themselves as still engaged in this kind of global anti-communist struggle.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, thinking, everything you said is spot on. And just thinking about this, from my own perspective as somebody who was born in the post-Cold War world and who came of age, intellectually, politically, at the peak of, this sort of end of history narrative. And I use those sort of Lenin statues as just sort of an image to convey this sense of the impression that everybody had, in the 90s and in the 2000s, that, Leninism and the Lenin approach to politics is a dead letter that has been swept, into the dustbin of history. And now that, the Western liberal capitalist world is undergoing all of these overlapping crises, economic inequality, political legitimacy, social stratification. All of a sudden, that those, dead Lenin statues and monuments, they take on a different perspective, and you realize that we still, inhabit Lenin's world in a way. If China wins this thing, Taiwan, mastery over the global economy, South China Sea, there's a chance, then, the 21st century could be dominated by a superpower that still professes to believe in Marxism, Leninism, So it's just an interesting thing. And it just flies in the face of the, another guy I cite in the piece, Francis Fukuyama, the whole notion that, market integration will somehow inevitably lead to political liberalism, which has been totally disproven. It's a provocative line of questioning, but I think it's just really interesting that all of this is happening. And I just thought the 100th anniversary of Lenin's death would be an appropriate occasion to bring all of this up.
No, that's a good point. And again, I think it does speak to the way that, in a way, kind of positioning himself and effectively kind of rhetorically positioning himself as this kind of insurgent radical. If you look at what he's doing in Argentina, he has taken some quite dramatic steps on the level of economic restructuring, whether we think they're good or bad. So, that's not to be dismissed as pure sort of culture war posturing. But what does seem weird and kind of disturbing about the way I saw that embraced by a lot of people is it does kind of reinforce this, aversion to the state as having a positive role. And again, this is, the reason this seems notable to me is all of the discussions about populism on the right and, the rise of figures including Trump and, Boris Johnson is sort of that, okay, the right, even in the kind of Anglosphere, typically known for its kind of laissez-faire biases, is finally embracing kind of the positive role of the state. And then you have someone like Milei basically coming in and just, kind of restating these basic kind of Reaganite principles that government is always the enemy, less government is always better than more, etc.
The funny thing is I could easily imagine Lenin giving a similar speech where he can stand up and he'll go, all of the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries and the constitutional Democrats and the Tsarists and the Western imperialists, you're all the same.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Like only we, the Bolsheviks, are the true upholders of liberty in the world of the workers' struggle, and everyone else is a fool. I could easily. It's a very Leninist site, and it would be good if within the global, the American and the broader kind of conservative right, if they had a similar kind of spirited debate amongst themselves. Between, the people like Milei who want to hold on to the Reagan Thatcher ideological dispensation, and the people who, I think Steve Bannon is one of these economic nationalist, national conservative populist types. It would be good if they had a debate, not unlike what the Soviet revolutionary generation had, which is, what direction do we want to take our movement in? That would be, to me, a reassertion of the old kind of materialist conception of politics, of actually being based on, definite, programmatic principles and policies. But instead, what you're seeing is just sort of this sort of blending together of, vibes and memes and images, and the ideological political economy questions are just lost in that. So, yeah, it's just interesting to see that happening, and I wish there was a better way to construct right-wing politics.
Well, I suppose we still await the true Lenin of our time.
Yes, just around the corner. I'm sure whoever that is already written for Compact.
Yeah, no doubt.
Or American Affairs, but
no doubt.
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Michael. Check out Michael's article on Lenin, as well as his previous work for us on issues around populism, the right, and the kind of sterility of the culture war. Thanks for this, and look forward to your next contribution.
Thank you so much, Geoff.
So that is it for this week's Compact Conversations. Thanks for joining us, Michael. As always, remember, Compact is an independent reader-supported publication, and we need your subscriptions to keep doing what we're doing. Please subscribe for $9 a month or $90 a year to get full access to all of our content, as well as priority access to Compact events, of which there are several coming. Please also remember to subscribe on your favorite channels to this podcast and give us 5 stars if you like what we're doing. Thanks, and see you next time.